Hello, Mr. Chung. In this video, I'll be talking about the countercultural movement as well as the conservative fundamental movement that happened in response to it in America in the 1960s. The countercultural movement was mainly composed of the boomer generation, which was the youth, and they opposed traditional cultural norms and authorities. The precursor to this movement were the beatniks during the Roaring Twenties, who would not conform to society and would focus on individualism. The countercultural movement was also rooted in the anti-Vietnam War protests that was caused by more people going to college and being educated. The countercultural movement encouraged the freedom of expression, peace, and as well as freedom of how you choose to love others. This also led to the sexual revolution. The people part of the countercultural movement rejected the social norms regarding sex. For example, they believe that you should be able to have more than one partner, and they also normalized premarital sex. We can see the sexualization of the media in music videos as well as ads. Because the young people who accepted the countercultural movement had rejected traditional values, there's a cultural clash between the young and older people. This led to there being less understanding between the younger and older generation. The movement also rejected the traditional Judeo-Christian values. We can see this in the sexual, but rather they accepted more of the Eastern Asian religions such as Buddhism, which is why you could see them both focusing on peace, spirituality, and nature. Some even made their self-sustaining communes, living off the land just as the Native Americans did. Communes, they would share everything, including clothes, foods, and even sexual partners. However, this movement eventually came to the end. This was because of the impracticality of it, as well as the fact that the youth were giving too much freedom. The music that was sort of the face of the countercultural music was rock, because it drew many of the youth and young people into the movement. Many countercultural rock stars died of overdose. This issue of drugs and overdosing was a huge issue within the countercultural movement. Initially, the countercultural movement started out as a way for the youth to express themselves, as well as to call out different problems within society, such as the Vietnam War and poverty. However, many people within this movement took this freedom to the extreme, which led to its downfall. The countercultural movement was sort of similar to the Lost Generation during the Roaring Twenties after World War I. These were authors who were part of the intellectual community and called out the American society for being fake and saw that the world was getting out of control despite their wide prosperity during the time. And even though they themselves were trying to make a change in society, many of them were alcoholics and died alone. Just like how the counterculture met its end partially through drugs. In addition to affecting society, the countercultural movement also affected politics by causing greater divisions between the Republican and Democratic parties. The Democratic Party holds more liberal values and therefore giving the government more power in order to help the needs of the people. The Republican Party are more conservative and they are for giving companies more power so that they could help with the needs of the people. Prior to the counterculture movement in the 1940s, both parties were aligned in that they were for government having more power to contain communism because of the Cold War, as well as for domestic affairs. However, in the 60s and the 70s, the parties began to be more divided because the Republicans had problems with the more liberal policies of the Democrats. During the 70s, when more people began to embrace the countercultural values, such as a sexual revolution, it was observed that divorce rates went up, and there were a lot more single moms because premarital sex was normalized. This increase in people accepting extreme liberalist values, as well as rejecting traditional Christian values, led to a counter-fundamentalist movement. This clash between Christianity and liberalism is similar to the clash between urban modernism and rural traditional fundamentalism during the Roaring Twenties. During the Roaring Twenties, there was a cultural difference between the urban cities and the rural areas. The urban areas accepted modernism, which was basically accepting new thinking and science over traditional religious values. The rural areas were fundamentalist and went against this social trend. This issue was displayed in the Scopes trial, which is on the issue of teaching evolution in schools. Alright, so back to the 70s, Jerry Falwell, a evangelical minister, had led this conservative backlash, and he founded the Moral Majority, which was an organization that sought to restore prayer in public schools, segregation in private schools, as well as overturn abortion. These Christians were trying to impose their Christian values onto society through politics. Because of this movement, many Christians today support the Republican Party. So here we can see the clash between two extremes of the spectrum, where the countercultural movement was in the liberalist extreme and the fundamentalist movement was in the conservative extreme. In the countercultural movement, people were given too much freedom. They tried to redefine sex, and many of them overdosed in drugs. And the people of the Moral Majority were trying to give church political power and get more people to follow Christ, not through reform, but through politics. So, what side should we as true Christians take? Well, if we look at the countercultural movement, we can see that it's not biblical. In the Bible, it tells us not to practice sexual immorality as well as to stay sober. In the countercultural movement, sexual immorality as well as the recreational use of drugs was rampant. Also, the fifth commandment tells us to honor our father and mother. In the countercultural movement, the youth were encouraged to dishonor their parents and believe that they were superior to them. On top of all of that, the countercultural movement rejects Christianity. On the extreme side of the conservative spectrum, we can see that the fundamentalist movement sought to give the church political power when they were trying to put back prayer in schools. And a side note on prayers, although we are an Adventist school and we have public prayers, I do not think that having prayers in public schools would necessarily help those Christians who are in the schools or those who are not Christian in the schools. I believe that prayer and your prayer life should be something private between you and God. In Matthew 6:6, Jesus tells us, "When thou prayest, enter into thy closet and pray to thy Father which is in secret." So the answers to that question would be that we should not choose a side. For one, choosing a side and affiliating your religion with a specific political party and basically combining state and church, in addition to all the bad things and the corruption that it could cause, it also could shine a bad light on the church. For example, during the French Revolution, when the papacy was overthrown, the people decided to do away with religion and the Bible. Throughout American history, Christians have put a bad image on the church. For example, many of them supported slavery, policies that put down people who were not financially stable, racial discrimination. Many Christians in the South were for racial discrimination. We can see this in how the Moral Majority was pushing for segregation in private schools. The liberals, who had rejected Christianity, were trying to solve the problems that the Christians had partly caused. The rejection of Christianity was due to their behavior both in society and politics. Also, the Christian movement is a movement that is not bound by political parties or countries. It transcends all those things. The kingdom of God is open to all people. I might have said this in one of my past videos, but while Jesus was on earth, he didn't make change through political reforms or through the law. He made change by reaching out to people's hearts. And that's the main principle we should follow here. We should seek to make change not by forcing our values onto society or compromising our values by conforming to society, but by changing people's hearts, by leading through example, through personal relationships, and spreading the love of God.